as was mentioned earlier in the show, the focus of this conversation is going to be what we're doing for our children and the newest plan that is being put together by the National Committee for Families and Children. Joining us for this conversation is the Monitoring and Evaluation Officer for the National Committee for Families and Children, Dylan Williams. And we're also joined by consultant from Belize Environmental Technologies, John Flowers. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning, and thanks for having us.
Now, I want to start off by just talking about the National Plan of Action and the work of the NCFC in terms of being able to execute it. Right?
All right, thanks again for having us. The NCFC really, in terms of the reason behind the plan, is really looking at the plan as a localized version of the Convention on the Rights of a Child. And so that gives us the opportunity to organize ourselves, to put some priority in terms of what do we want to see for children. And so when we looked at the previous plan that spanned from 2004 through to 2015, that provided that framework for us. And so in terms of the overall, I'd say, process of getting us organized, because of the fact that we work through the various line ministries, civil society organizations, basically it was their plan basically. And so those prioritized actions were in the area of education, health, child protection, HIV/AIDS, family and culture. Right, and so in doing that, basically as the evaluation that we conducted at the end of the process is to really show us what lessons have been learned in this process. And so the NCFC intends to take those lessons learned and translate it into this new plan. And so when we look at the process of the last plan, we realize that in terms of the overall design, for example, those provided us with the fact that because the plan was bipartisan, that allowed for the transitions between government. And so that lesson in itself ensured that as a plan, as a macro plan, it can be supported by various political directives or direction. No? When we speak of, for example, the consultative process, so we want to ensure not only stakeholders, but the children themselves who are to benefit from this plan also are involved in the process. And so taking that from that plan and integrating it into this plan is definitely one of the lessons that we have carried over. When we speak of, for example, the fact that in terms of overall implementation, whilst to say that there are certain things that we learned as a heavy lesson, if we want to coin it that way, in terms of implementation is to ensure that the plan doesn't remain static. Right? And I think these long-term plans, because of the fact that they are long-term, there is new things and emerging issues, right, that comes along. And so we've learned definitely that we have to ensure that we take into consideration and keep these things on track in terms of how is it that we prioritize actions within these plans to ensure that it is relevant and specific. No?
Let's talk about the completion of the first NP, the National Plan of Action. And this is essentially just your priority actions for making a better life for children and adolescents in this country. And I know the NCFC works to coordinate with all the government ministries to be able to do so. You said there were some heavy lessons learned from the first process. Looking at what has been accomplished and what was most successful, what are some of the good practices that you were able to identify within the first process that will carry into the second? And what were some of the challenges that you're going to try to mitigate?
Okay. I think one of the I guess success is the fact that the responsibilities that we have to coordinate in this process in terms of a coordinating mechanism, ensuring that we keep this process of or this mechanism of coordinating because of the fact that there's a lot of different aspects, a lot of different plans that exist, and there needs some type of coordinating framework for us to ensure that we're all on the same page towards a direction. I think that is definitely one of the key lessons that we have learned to use. In terms of also the fact that we want to ensure that we in terms of achievements overall, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I think one of the key things that we have learned in terms of heavy lessons is the fact that the re-immersion process, because there's a lot of people that changed over time, and so we want to ensure that there's some type of re-immersion strategy to ensure that people are continuously informed of the process as they move in and out of it. And I think that is significant because the key lesson there is that persons were not necessarily updated to time, right? And so as these happened, you know, in terms of from design and then into implementation, that changed, right? And so one of the key things is that we ensure that there's both a re-immersion and a communication aspect to ensure that those are high priority, because as people move in and out, we want to do that, no? So
maybe just to chime in a little bit, because I know Dylan was focusing more a little bit on the processes.
Yes.
But certainly in terms of the outcomes, overall results I think have been mixed, if I could put it that way. There were some gains, for example, in education. There was increase in access. There's also in the latter years we see the initiative to reform financing, particularly secondary school, to make things more equitable. For example, in the area of social protection, we see the introduction of what we call modern policy instruments, like the BOOST instrument, the introduction of the targeting registry through the Ministry of Human Development. So we think those are some of the important elements and system tools and processes. And for example, in HIV and AIDS, we see really significant gains in the reduction of transmission, what we call prevention of mother to child transmission. And so those are some of the significant gains, and certainly there are quite a bit of unfinished business, which is why perhaps more so than any other reason, there's a rationale for the development of a new agenda for children that certainly takes the lessons learned, that certainly builds on the successes and looks at how, what are the things that we carry forward and what are the elements that perhaps we need to bring into this new frame.
Generally, in the development of a policy document, a big part of the challenge is to populate it in terms of letting people know exactly what your stated objectives are and how they can plug into it. How does this new policy that you're going to develop actually make sure that people have a significant input, but once it's completed, they also want to be a part of the continual process?
Right. And maybe we could speak to that a little bit as part of the support consultancy team. One of the elements and one of the lessons is indeed that the issues of communication, and how is it that you socialize and communicate the development framework. How do you ensure that there is not just buy-in during the development phase of the plan, but throughout the implementation stages? And so we've talked about how to ensure that there is a robust and dynamic planning cycle, an annual planning cycle, where as a sector you plan jointly, you review jointly, and of course the implementers execute. So there is a proposal to ensure that around the various, and I'm getting into the plan, but this plan, we're proposing to organize it through the life cycle stages, if I could put it that way.
Okay.
So from the expectant mother, from the pregnant mother, all the way to the young adolescent. And we're working hard to ensure that there is good synergy between the children, adolescents, and the youth component. As you're aware, you have the ECD commitments that have been recently endorsed by Cabinet.
Early childhood
development constitutes, you could say, the policy commitments of the government. We have the national youth policy, and so we're looking to ensure that there is seamless transition between these two age cohorts, if I could put it that way, and to ensure that there is the kinds of investments, because what you do or don't do in one life cycle stage shows up in the other. And I think the lessons are really crystal clear in front of us where we have dropped the ball.
And I want to talk about that because I think when people assess the current situation with children and adolescents in the country, we all tend to be very critical and we don't think about where we may have missed opportunities to help children, that they don't get involved in criminal activity, that they stay in school, that teenage pregnancy isn't a problem as we see today. So when you are to look at some of the areas where perhaps either not enough emphasis or progress was made, what would you identify those to be, and what are some of the reasons why there were challenges?
Okay.
Go ahead,
I think in terms of when we look at that, and as John alluded to earlier, when we look at, for example, where we were in the beginning of the previous plan in terms of early childhood development, there wasn't necessarily a big focus there, right? And also the fact that we understand now, and even more now, that those early investments is definitely necessary. Because when we look at early childhood and we look at the various support that is being provided, for example, from the Ministry of Education, from the Ministry of Health, ensuring that there are the relevant, in terms of the expectant mothers taking their requisite nutritional supplements and all of that. And when we look at, for example, the support from Ministry of Human Development side, so we look at all the key players, we understand that these are definitely necessary steps. Again, when we looked at, for example, the 10 to 14 bracket, and we understand that this transition year between, as John said earlier, children to adolescent, and we look at the services being provided, definitely that's a large gap. In terms of a focus area that we need to definitely prioritize in this coming plan, and being proactive in the planning approach, because of the fact that we have already identified that, we've tried to ensure that it's in terms of the early childhood policy commitments as well as the youth policy, and ensuring that these systems or these two areas start speaking to each other, because of course we can't give, if you put it in that term, we can't give the Ministry of Youth, for example, and the services that they provide, the young people that has far more irreversible factors to them than if we have invested in them earlier. And so that responsibility for them would then be just to ensure that for example, their productive years are much more advanced, ensuring that they're participating. And so you have that focus from the Ministry of Youth, but they would have already been built in with the requisite pieces that they need from an early area.
And just to jump in a little bit, indeed, as you know, the early years, early childhood development phase and the adolescent phase are two of the most vulnerable times in the life cycle for children and young persons. And we really, as you say, what are some of the challenges? And I think as we looked at retrospectively at the first phase of the national plan, we realized that the NPA was developed sort of by thematic issues, education, health, child protection, and that's okay. It helps to identify what the priority issues are within the thematic areas.
And there were smaller objectives.
Right. But then when you look at how the issues manifest themselves within families, within communities, they don't appear in these silos. And then you find that the institutional structures are set up in these silos. And so what this new plan seeks to do is to force a little bit the coordination, the seamless government as it is called, to ensure that the issues that are impacting families are addressed in a holistic manner. And so whether it is health, whether it's education, whether it's labor and employment, whether it is housing, that you have almost like a one-stop arrangement. And I know the Ministry of Human Development is now piloting what they're calling wraparound service models, which seeks to do just that, to look at the vulnerable families and see what are the issues impacting them. How can you introduce accompaniment with social workers and to work with these families that are perhaps don't have the level of functioning, because as we spoke about children and adolescents, the cross-cutting issue of parenting is also another area where there's a huge gap. And so to beef up or to strengthen up the community parenting program, for example, the roving caregivers program, the boost program, all the other evidence-based initiatives that we know provide reasonable outcomes for children and families. I think that is where we're trying to put the emphasis on in this new agenda, because there are a number of activities and initiatives out there, but not all of them yield good results. Some of them sometimes are more counterproductive than anything else. And people may say, but yeah, we need to do something, yes, but we need to do things that make a difference in the lives of children and families.
And when you're talking about a lot of the social protection issues that needs to be addressed, how do you get people to understand and to actually participate fully in the programs and not look at it necessarily as a handout and, you know, the overall challenge of always letting it be a part of the culture of dependency on government, where traditionally that has been a big part of what happens in Belize. What is government going to do as opposed to what can I do?
They need to help me.
Once I have some support to climb out of my situation.
I think that's a good question, William, and it's a broader question that we had pondered with for some time ago. When you think about what is it, what's the vision, and what is people's attitude towards social protection, as we call it, rather than looking at it as a hands up or as a grapple hook to prevent you from falling deeper into poverty or exclusion. You know, we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we want for our society as a nation? What is it we want for children? How do we treat our children? How do we treat our elderly? How do we treat our persons with disabilities and those who are unable to find gainful employment because for whatever reasons they lack the skills to enter productive employment? So we need to ask ourselves those questions. We want to just how do we treat our homeless people, you know? These are questions we need to ask ourselves as a society, and I don't think we have taken the time to step back and do that and to craft for ourselves where is it as a nation 30 plus years after independence that we would like to go on. What is it that we want to define for ourselves? And so the idea behind social protection floors is exactly that, to ensure that there is dignity in every person's life. And so how do we create that kind of environment? And as we look at crafting this new development agenda for children and adolescents, certainly they don't exist in a vacuum. As I said, we're looking at the family, we're looking at the communities, but we need to ensure that at the end of the day, we take a positive view towards development. So we're looking at outcomes for all children and young people, positive child and youth development. But within that, there is a focus on vulnerable children and families. The children with disabilities, the children who are engaged in child labor, all of these, and the children who are abused and exploited. So we need to have, yes, an overall positive frame, but within that we need to recognize that there are certain realities. And it's a smaller proportion of the children and youth population, but nonetheless very vulnerable, even more so vulnerable
with devastating effects.
Exactly. And I think these are some of the issues we're seeing manifesting themselves in the crime and violence and in pregnancy. But we cannot just treat the symptoms because there are so many symptoms.
I want to jump in because I think that's such a critical point. We talk about things like sexual abuse, for example, incest, commercial sexual exploitation of children. All of these things take place within our society. Whether we close our eyes to them or not, they come out on the news at some point in time, perhaps the 1-2 cases, which is just the tip of the iceberg. And I hear very clearly, the work that has to be done to make the lives of children in our country better has to be across the board. All children need a good quality life, but we have to be able to help those who are most vulnerable. My question to you is, how do you look at prevention of some of these issues? Absolutely important to address the needs of the vulnerable population, but how do we prevent the unborn child at this point or a toddler at this point that they don't have to face the kind of atrocities that we do see in our vulnerable populations?
And that's where I think,
where in the consultation have we been able to get that? I know it's a huge, it's a tall order, but it's something we have to start to address.
if I could just back up a little bit, and that's where, for example, as you said, the unborn child represents opportunity.
Yes.
I mean, you could be, as we said, the next Martin Luther King. You could be the next Antonio Soberanis. You could be anything because you're unborn and you're full of potential. But once you're born and then you're into this environment, it is up to us now as the adults to shape and to nurture that. And so it is indeed in this light that we look at the transitions across the life stages, because if we don't pay attention to the various vulnerabilities at the various stages in the child's life cycle, then we drop the ball. Because some of these things are hidden and they don't manifest themselves until 10, 12, 18 years later. And so it's sort of a silent, and it creeps up on you and then it explodes right in your face. And then we act as if though we're totally surprised. So how do we go about that? And I think the investments in health and education, for example, and the use of the policy instrument like Boost to help to ensure that vulnerable families, the children remain in school, that they are getting their vaccinations on time, and that in fact they are participating in the system. Now, it doesn't guarantee the quality of the services in the system, so that's on the other side, but at least it provides in terms of the supply, that the children are in fact participating. But then it requires the other side that ensures that we have demand for quality. And that's where I think the broader society needs to become more active in the process of development. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to jump in and say something, because we have continued to do, we have some new interventions. But we've continued to do largely a lot of the same things, especially when it comes to the legal aspect of it, in terms of creating laws that will reach further and protect our children in ways that, we have grown, I wouldn't say anything more than complacent, that, we have enough laws on the books. We don't need to revamp. But when you look at globally, some of the things that are there, in terms of where we're going. Recently, we had a big conversation about the curfew and just child protection in general, and some of the things that we take for granted in terms of what we do because it's the culture and what is practiced in Belize, and we leave it there. So how do you actually, as a part of the development of a new NPA, how do you plan to also look at what needs to be done in terms of legal reform to actually put some teeth into what we have to do as well?
I think this comes back to the question Marlene had asked in terms of how do you ensure that there is adequate focus on the preventative side? Because when the monster is up in your face, you feel compelled to act. And then it's knee-jerk, and then it's quick fixes and band-aids and suppression type strategies, and these don't get you very far. And so if we take this kind of long-term vision, yes, we know it's a parallel process because you have to intervene.
You can't stop one to do the other.
Exactly. But in terms of investing, the analogy of the dangerous stream, we can't wait until the people are jumping in the river and start pulling them out downstream. We got to find out why they're jumping in the stream in the first place. And I think that's where the investments are. And so in terms of some of the initiatives that are on the ground, they're in their project phases, if I could put it that way, because they're not yet program components. But like the Youth and Community Transformation Project under Human Development, the COPS project, these are initiatives that look at citizen security and safety, but they come from a prevention side. And so they look at community, it's really all community development package under public safety, if I could put it that way. But these are the kinds of interventions that you want to ensure, which are evidence-based and find their way into the programmatic sphere of government, so that in fact they can have the long-term impact of cutting off the issues before they become to a point where we can handle them. No?
I think to also add from a different perspective too, is to to ensure that we also understand where responsibility lines start occurring, no? And so when we look at, for example, the preventative side, we want to ensure that parents also understand their responsibility in the wider process. Where they cannot necessarily take on that responsibility, then the state steps in, and ensure that the programs are of the quality as John spoke about. So we want to ensure that when we're speaking of starting that prevention process from the home,
Yeah.
right? And ensuring that, for example, parent understand how to parent, understand how a child develops. And so I think all of that fits into us ensuring that the wider process and the wider bases are covered, because really a lot of the issues really starts at the home, and the fact that parents needs to be equipped with the requisite skill of parenting, right? And so that's definitely necessary.
So let me ask my favorite question. And, you know, I think most people know it's near and dear to my heart. Where are the children? How are the children fitting into this process of coming up with a plan that they feel is important to them? You know, we talk about the CRC, you know, it's fundamentally important that children have a voice, that they're able to participate, and that they can be a part of decisions that affect them. Kudos to UNICEF and the municipalities that are doing the child-friendly municipalities, because they have children as a part of their advisory board to tell them things that we as adults just no longer see, like the public drunkards on the street, or the safety issues that they feel, or the street harassment that children are saying they're uncomfortable with. So my question to you is, where are the children in this process?
In the overall design, Marlene, because we knew that the face-to-face consultations with children and young people would certainly be limited by space and resources.
Yeah.
So some 2 months ago, we opened up the consultations to a wider element where we engage with children in secondary schools particularly. And we did sort of a qualitative survey. We didn't call it that, but we asked the schools to work with the social studies and English language teachers to have like sessions with their children, either in class as seat work or as an assignment, to look at some of the critical issues as identified by the children impacting them, to look at what are some of the recommendations they have for addressing these issues, who they thought should be responsible in addressing them, and what was their personal role and commitment to addressing these issues. So schools did that, and we have quite a bit of submissions that we're synthesizing now, and those will form a platform at the face-to-face consultations, where we will present, we'll have young people present what the children are saying, for example. So that's one component. We also opened up with an expressive arts competition and an essay competition around the same issues, critical issues affecting children and adolescents. What are recommendations? Who should address them, and what is my personal role in all this? So those are sort of the corresponding
So even if they
themes.
couldn't say it, they could paint it.
They could paint it, draw it. They could.
Fantastic,
It could be a poem. It could be a song. It could be any of those components. And so again, we're looking at what they were saying in those submissions, and those form a part of the synthesis that would be presented in the face-to-face to say, these kick off the face-to-face consultations in the various districts, and we ask the question, well, this is what children nationally are saying. Are these the same issues you're facing? If not, what is different for you in your reality, and so on and so on. So that's one way of engaging the young people. And I know the NCFC has opened up an online page that invites, Dylan can talk a little bit more about that.
Well, as John said, we also wanted to ensure that in terms of the wider coverage, that once you're not able to either be on the face-to-face or have participated in those competitions, we created the online space whereby some of the same templates that were used within the school environment can be downloaded. You can fill them out and you can send them back to us as a part of the consultation. Additionally, we've provided also key documents for review for stakeholders themselves. And we want to ensure, as the process of consultation happens, you know, young people across the country can look at these very short synopsis of what happened within the various consultations. So as we're moving through the various districts, we'll be updating those and ensuring that, you know, you can see what, for example, a Corozal consultation looked like. You can see what a Stan Creek consultation looked like. And so we want to ensure that children and stakeholders are fully involved in this process, and they can continuously, up until the point of which we are going to close the consultation, provide your input into the process. And again, outside of the actual online platform, you know, if their teachers and their teachers or principal who want to engage their students as well in this kind of conversation, they can also call us for the template. We'll send a template again to them for those who have not necessarily submitted. So we want to ensure that they can participate in this process and get their realities, as I call it, in and their feedback into the process.
And that was one of the questions I had, because how does the consultation, how deep does it go to actually capture the nuances that we have, even though we're a small population, as we move from district to district, it is so nuanced.
Yeah.
How does the consultation seek to capture that and then actually let it impact the policy so that we don't paint with one broad brush?
Exactly. And that's an important question, William, because indeed we are in the process of developing this national agenda for children and adolescents into the year 2030. It's really a macro level.
Yeah.
But indeed, there are some specifics that impact on children and young people growing up in their individual districts and communities. And so indeed, when we look at the methodology that we're using for the children's part of the consultation, we're calling it a visioning exercise. And so what we do, we ask the children to basically dream about the Belize that we want, that they want, and they paint that picture. What is it that they see for Belize in the year 2030? And then we bring them back to reality, the Belize that we have. What are the critical issues impacting you? And so having painted the picture of where we are and where it is we want to go, we then force them a little bit, push them in the direction of identifying what are some critical strategies and actions that need to be put in place, that we need to do to get from where we are to where it is you say we want to be. And so that's kind of the methodology we're using, sort of a gap analysis, if you wish, to bring them into the whole participation scheme, but at the same time bring out the issues as well.
And how successful have you been in that? Because a lot of people are still skeptical whether or not children can help to formulate a plan of this magnitude.
I think, Marlene, some year when we were developing the first national plan of action, there was a prominent, I won't call any names, prominent figure in Belize, and maybe not so learned, because the person said, why are you even consulting with children? They have nothing to offer. And that just shows you where we are, or where maybe that person is. But I think that person is representative of a larger sector in the Belizean society, of how we think about children. But you'd be amazed at the ages where children are innovative. They don't have boundaries, they don't have all the baggage like we do. And so you want to hear from them, because that's where the innovation comes. That's where they tell you the issues as they see it, no holds barred, as they would say. And so indeed, that's what we want to bring out in a very organic way and get these ideas from them, so that in fact, as consultants, then we take that and we frame that into the technical language, but we're hoping later on there will be the child-friendly version where it makes sense to them as well.
Yeah.
To quickly also add, in terms of, we spoke of the vulnerable populations as well, and so we'll have special sessions outside of these face-to-face district sessions with them, and so those are going to be as a part of the consultations, in terms of, for example, children with disability, as John said, also those in institutions as well. And so those will require definitely special skill sets. And so we're also considering those and ensuring that those also happen.
And my last question just has to do with timeline. Obviously, we're at the completion of we have completed the first phase, the first national plan of action, and you're consulting for the second. What is the expectation that you'll have it ready, and will there be a bipartisan approach as well?
To answer that, definitely. In terms of wrapping up the consultation process, we're looking at early June in terms of the first week to wrap up the consultation process. Therefore, we then move into finalization through to the end of July. That's our time frame. And so, because of the fact that we have missed the 2016 budget cycle, and because of the fact we're promoting the cycles for planning, budgeting, and all of that, we are starting 2017 through to 2030 as we've indicated. And then also we've additionally started the process of ensuring that we then take this larger macro plan into the first 3-year plan of action. And so that as a lesson learned, we were at 5 years. Now we're considering much more a shorter term process now. And so that's the plan.
And so just to say that in terms of the district level consultations, starting next week, the 24th, simultaneous consultations in Stan Creek and Orange Walk. And then the 26th, we do simultaneous consultations in the Cayo district and in Belize district. And the subsequent week, on the 31st, I believe it is, we do Toledo and Corozal. And so that takes us across the country, and then there is a special session for the Belmopan area, because recognizing that Cayo is quite spread out geographically. And just to say, Marlene, that in addition, and perhaps the most important persons in this process, the children themselves, but because of the need for commitment from the policymakers, we have sought the engagement. We have engaged the CEOs in the critical ministries. We have also sought cabinet's endorsement of the process, because as you say, at the end of the day, it's where the policymakers and the issues facing by the children and adolescents who are impacted. We need to bring the top and the bottom together to ensure that this plan remains dynamic and relevant, and that in fact it meets with the resource commitments. William spoke about the legal frames and so on, and I think we sometimes we tend to quickly move to legal instruments to effect changes, but I think we also have to understand that programmatically, programs and budgets are perhaps two of the more important elements to also effect policy changes. And not, because we can have the laws, but they're not effective. And so we need to bring a balance of instruments to ensure that at the end of the day, we are providing for our children and young people the best environment. And it only makes sense to plan for these two cohorts combined.
All right.
Well, gentlemen, we want to thank you very much for joining us this morning. And of course, when you are nearing to the end, we'd like to have another conversation.
Excellent. And I know we would be nearing to the end as consultants, but it will be at the start of the process.
All right.
Definitely appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking to representatives of a new organization established in Belize called PEFEL. So stay tuned.